silent mode. Right now, we start the lecture, Democracy and Artificial Intelligence. We inform that the questions can be submitted through the QR code that you see on your seat, and they will be answered according to the availability of time. We also highlight that the lecture will be in English. If you wish, you have the audio devices for translation. At the table of honor, His Excellency Justice Luiz Roberto Barroso, President of the Supreme Court of Brazil and the National Council of Justice, His Lordship Dr. Lawrence Lessig, Professor of the Chair Roy Furman of Law and Leadership at the University of Harvard, and Her Lordship Dr. Aline Osório, General Secretariat of the Presidency of the Supreme Court of Brazil. We also would like to thank of the presence of His Excellencies Minister Esther Dweck, the Minister of Innovation and Public Services, Minister Luiz Manuel, the Minister of Science and Technology and Innovation, Ambassador Romulo Acuri of the Peruvian Embassy in Brazil, the President of the Constitutional Court of Peru, Marcos Rogério de Souza, Special Secretariat for Judicial Matters of the Presidency of the Republic, Mr. Dario Durigan, Executive Secretary of the Ministry of Economy, judges, members of the Public Ministry, professors, alumni, public workers, press professionals, ladies and gentlemen. Right now, with the floor, His Excellency Justice Luiz Roberto Barroso. Good morning, everyone. It's a great pleasure, great joy to open this session and to receive here at the Supreme Court the Professor Lawrence Lessig to talk about this topic in artificial intelligence and democracy, one of the most challenging topics of our times. There's something new under the sun. There's a profound transformation taking place in the world under the impact of AI, with positive potentiality of great number and also immense risks. Therefore, it's for us to reflect upon these topics and also the impact that they produce on the traditional visions of democracy that we receive Professor Lawrence Lessig. As announced, he's a professor of law and leadership at the University of Harvard, and before that, he was the founder of the Center for Internet and Society of the Stanford University, also at the University of Chicago. And before becoming a professor, he had a very highlighted career as an assistant, as a clerk, of two judges that have been very influential in the U.S., Judge Richard Posner at the Court of Appeals of the Seventh Circuit. He is known by many of us by his works published about law and economy and about the role of the judges and also about judicial interpretation in general, and equally of the Justice of the Supreme Court, Antonin Scalia, equally someone relevant in the thinking of the U.S. He also acts in a council of AXA Research Fund, and he is an emeritus member of the Council of the Creative Commons. He is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and also for the American Philosophical Association. He has received many prizes, including the prize Freedom of the Free Software Foundation and the prize Fast Case 50. In 2002 was named as one of the 50 visionaries of the Scientific American. We are very delighted to receive Professor Lawrence Lessig. He is also has a bachelor in economy and administration by the University of Pennsylvania. He is a master in philosophy by Cambridge and doctor in law, and has a degree in law for the University of Yale. Before passing the floor to Professor Lessig, I will be passing the floor to the General Secretariat of the Supreme Court, Aline Osório. She was a student and an assistant of Professor Lessig that would like to say a few words. Aline, Good morning, everyone. We would like to thank you for your presence. And before passing the floor to Professor Lessig, I would like to do a brief introductory note on a personal note, actually, in his homage, and I will do so in English.
Privilege to introduce one of the most brilliant and committed public intellectuals of our time, Professor Lawrence Lessig. Professor Lessig has reshaped our understanding of democracy and technology, from copyright and internet freedom to campaign finance and constitutional interpretation. His work asks us what makes democracy real and what prevents it from becoming so. So I had the honor of being his student at Harvard Law School back in 2017. And I was also lucky enough to serve as his research assistant while he was writing his book, Fidelity and Constraint. To be honest, I often wonder if I truly had the skills for the role, but for me, it was a masterclass in legal reasoning and intellectual integrity. I remain profoundly grateful for his trust and guidance. So what inspires me most about Professor Lessig is his deep public spirit, his determination to confront democracy's deepest flaws and reimagine its future. So today he brings that same conviction to one of the most urgent topics of our time, how democracy can survive in the age of artificial intelligence. It's a conversation we need, and no one is better placed to lead it. So please join me in welcoming Professor Lawrence Lessig.
So I can't describe adequately how grateful I am to be here and have the chance to address you. I have a deep fondness for Brazil. I've been to Brazil many times, though this is the first time in Brasilia. And I've learned in my time in Brazil a great deal about the character of democracy. I remember once following Gilberto Gil as he went through really a public festival. And he was the culture minister at the time. And as he moved through the festival, he moved with the people, and everybody came up to him and grabbed his hand and told him what they thought. And I thought, that's not how government officials operate. In America, there would be 100 yards between the government official and the public, and they would never risk ordinary people talking to a government official. It just doesn't happen. And I thought from that moment 20 years ago that we have so much to learn from the struggles and the inspiration and the ideals that Brazil is showing the world. And so I come here to share my thoughts, and I've enjoyed learning from the reaction to these thoughts, what Brazil has to teach. So if we can shift to the slides, we can start the show. Great. So in December of 2024, this man, Sam Altman, wrote a tweet. The tweet said this: algorithmic feeds are the first at-scale misaligned AIs. So algorithmic feeds, meaning the feeds that come across your Facebook or Twitter or TikTok channels, algorithmic, run by AI. The first at-scale misaligned AI, meaning the first misaligned AI that mattered fundamentally to society. And it did matter in America in 2024 because most think that election was driven fundamentally by the effect that social media had on the public's understanding of the issues at play. Okay, I want to say two things about what Sam Altman said. First, I want to say just how right what he said is. And second, I want to say just how wrong what he said is. or in the vernacular of my time, how screwed that means we are, given how right he is. So let's start with how right he is. The first, at-scale misaligned AIs. In 2024, AIs mattered in our elections in two different ways. Number one, intended, and number two, as a byproduct of something else. So intended. There were two ways in which AI mattered in an intended way in 2024. Number one, there were foreign actors using AI to sow dissent in the United States elections. So there were many fake Russian news sites that populated the American news economy. There were bot farms used to spread misinformation about Ukraine and pro-Kremlin messages. The Chinese engaged in this massive campaign paralleling the 50-cent party in China, which is basically flooding channels with either distracting information or information reinforcing views they wanted to prevail. And in America, this is an underreported story, but there was this extraordinary dynamic where in what's called news deserts, which are areas in the United States where there's no local newspaper, these fake AI-driven websites would be set up pretending to be a local newspaper. And so as people would surf the net in those areas, there was a 50-50 chance that they would come across a newspaper that they thought was a legitimate local newspaper, and in fact, it was just an AI LLM-generated newspaper from Russia. Or TikTok in 2024 had an extraordinary impact in Romania as they demonstrated how it was used to create effectively a fake presidential candidate. And then the court was required to step in and annul the election, which from the American perspective was a little bit surprising. No court in America could annul our elections. But anyway, that was the effect they actually had. So those are the foreign actors. And then there were domestic actors desperately trying to affect the election. There was a big push to how it would change and did change how fundraising happened in America. And then there were all these clumsy efforts to use AI to affect people's votes, including the president suggesting that Taylor Swift had endorsed his campaign, or candidates using this cheap kind of AI to begin to reinforce the message of their campaign. Or here's a particularly striking example on Twitter. So there's
another dream. Yes, it is me, Martin Luther King. I came back from the dead to say something. As I was saying, I have another dream. That Anthony Hudson will be Michigan's 8th district's next congressman. Yes, I have a dream again.
Or here's an ad that was a political ad, and in the middle of the ad, it was an attack on a candidate, and this image came up on the ad. And this image evoked a debate that was happening in far right-wing news channels that the left wing was trying to get rid of gas stoves in America. Now, it's completely ridiculous. It's not something that's actually true. But the idea that there was a protest where people were using these signs, these anti-gas stove signs, was quite striking until you read the fine print in the ad, which is to say that all of these images were AI generated. There's no reality to this story, yet this story was what was used to push the campaign of the candidate that was attacking the person on the left. Okay. Now, I think if we look at all these and say, if this is what AI was in the 2024 elections, at least the domestic effect, it was overblown. Didn't really matter. It said was going to be the AI election year. It turned out this was not the AI election year in America. Okay, but that was not AI's important effect. The important effect was not the intended effect, the effort by people to use AI intentionally to have an effect on the results. It was a byproduct effect. And it was a byproduct effect because of new media or social media and the effect of social media, unintended, let's hope, on the character of understanding that Americans had about the issues that they confronted in that election. This is Tristan Harris, who was a Google engineer until he left and started the Center for Humane Technology, became quite prominent in a movie called The Social Dilemma, which told the story of social media and its effect on youth and democracy across the world. Tristan Harris is focused on the science of attention when he was at Google, which is an effort to engineer attention, the attention of the users, to overcome the natural resistance they would have to these social media platforms so as to increase the engagement people have with those platforms. This is what happens at every major social media platform. And we should think of it as a kind of brain hacking. Brain hacking. Well, think first about body hacking. This is a great book by Michael Moss, Salt, Sugar, Fat, which tells the story of food science, the processed food industry and the food science that guides them. It's a science where they learn to engineer food, the mix of salt, sugar, and fat in food, in order to exploit evolution to overcome our natural resistance to eating too much so that we can't stop eating the food. They do this in order to sell food, or we maybe say, quote, food. And that effort is harmless for many, but for others, it's not at all harmless. This is what I mean by body hacking. Well, brain hacking is the same thing with respect to attention. It's an effort to overcome evolution, exploiting facts about who we are produced by evolution. The fact that we are irrationally responsive to random rewards. The fact that we psychologically can't resist bottomless pits of content. They use these facts about us to tweak their products, all with the aim to increase our engagement so that they could sell ads. This is a business model. We should call it the engagement business model. And the critical point to recognize is AI drives this business model. AI is what makes it work. And it creates an incentive then, the AI and this business model, as Shoshana Zuboff describes in her magisterial, The Age of Surveillance Capitalism. The incentive is to know more about us, not just by watching us, but by poking us, tweaking us, asking us questions, rendering us vulnerable, reaching down the brain stack to leverage our insecurity so that they can better sell ads. Okay, now the key here is that in so doing this business model imposes externalities on us. Externalities on the United States, externalities on the world. As Zeynep Tufekci puts it, the companies are in the business of monetizing attention, and not necessarily in ways that are conducive to health or the success of social movements or the public spheres, because it just turns out, too bad for us, the best strategy, the most profitable strategy to drive engagement is the politics of hate. We engage more, the more extreme, the more polarizing, the more hate-filled this content is. AI learns that fact about us. This passage from a book by an extraordinary AI scholar, Stuart Russell, I think captures this dynamic powerfully. Apologies, I'm going to quote it at length. He describes the algorithms and how they function on social media. And he says, they aren't particularly intelligent, but they are in a position to affect the entire world because they directly influence billions of people. Typically, he writes, such algorithms are designed to maximize click-throughs, that is, the probability that the user clicks on presented items. The solution is simply to present items that the user likes to click on, right? Wrong. Wrong. The solution is to change the user's preferences so that they become more predictable. Change users' preferences. A more predictable user can be fed items that they're likely to click on, thereby generating more revenue. People with more extreme political views tend to be more predictable in which items they will click on, Possibly there's a category of articles that diehard centrists are likely to click on, but it's not easy to imagine what this category consists of. Like any rational entity, the algorithm, the AI, learns how to modify the state of its environment, in this case, the user's mind, in order to maximize its own reward. AI learns how to do that, and so that's what we are fed. And in this fantastic book by Max Fisher, he tracks how in these 4 countries, America, Brazil, with the Zika virus scandals, UK, and in Germany, the spread of social media is directly linked to the increased radicalization of the public, because the AI learns that if it can radicalize the people consuming the content, those people are more likely to consume more content. So the machine turns us into extremists so it can sell more ads. Algorithmic feeds, as Sam Altman puts it, were this first at-scale misaligned AI. Now, the point to recognize is this is not about technology. It's not just about technology. This feeding is part of an economy. As Renée DiResta puts it, the former head of the Internet Observatory at Stanford and the author of a really extraordinary book, Invisible Rulers, that economy has 3 components. There are influencers, people who are in the business of trying to get people to follow what they do. There are algorithms. I didn't really have a picture of an algorithm, but you get the idea here. And then there are crowds, us, the people who are consuming this content. And the point is these 3 things work together. The influencers are learning how to leverage the algorithms, and the algorithms learning how to leverage the influencers and the crowds to drive engagement, together yielding increasingly what Renée calls bespoke realities. Meaning we don't live in one reality, we each live in our own separate, self-constructed realities. As Barack Obama puts it, if you watch Fox News, you're in one reality. If you read the New York Times, you're in a different reality. So for example, these horrible pictures from our January event, January 6th, not January 8th. The critical thing about these people is that they believed the election has been stolen. They believed that. They had been led to believe that by the media they had consumed and the leaders they had followed. Just after January 6th, Washington Post reported 70% of Republicans believed the election had been stolen. And not just uneducated Republicans, a majority of college-educated Republicans believed the election had been stolen. And so 70% of Republicans means 32% of Americans believed the election was stolen. That graph is terrifying enough. But even more terrifying is this. In the time since January 6, 2021, the number of people who believe the election was stolen has not changed. There's the same number of people today who believe the election was stolen as in 2021. And this fact is new. Richard Nixon, President of the United States, almost impeached for his scandal around Watergate, had public opinion polls approval ratings looking like this until about 6 months before he resigned. So the red line is Republicans. He's liked by Republicans about as much as Donald Trump was or is. He's not hated as much by Democrats as Donald Trump is, and the independents are in the middle. But in the 6 months leading up to his ultimately resigning, this is what happens to his public opinion support. What's striking about this graph is that all 3 groups lose support for the president at the same rate because they are not living in bespoke realities. They're living in a common reality, what we used to just call reality. But in our current age, this is the approval rating for Donald Trump, who went through 2 impeachment trials. It never changed. It never changed because each group is living in their own bespoke reality, and every fact can be reinterpreted to reinforce what we in our own bespoke realities want to believe. This is the new normal, created, generated, supported, funded by this AI-driven media. And this bespokedness begets, or we should say, bespokedness optimizes for what I think we should call fantasists. I wrote a piece in Medium describing fantasists. I said, we live in an age of fantasists, a time when people not quite constrained by reality flourish nonetheless. The term is not as harsh as fabulist, a person who lives in a make-believe world, think George Santos. It's more forgiving than liar or mythomaniac, the condition of being a pathological liar. Fantasists don't necessarily believe that what they're saying is false. They just don't know whether what they're saying is true, and they don't really care. Their words construct the reality they seek. So it's astonishing to recognize the United States government has 3 quintessential fantasists at the helm. So RFK Jr., who has promulgated all sorts of malarkey around vaccines and fluoride, inspires states to just stop having fluorides in their water. Donald Trump, who repeatedly constructs these completely made-up truths and repeats them over and over again until a significant portion of the public believes them. And then Elon Musk, who goes out and describes all these magical things he's going to do, uttering just literally crazy talk. The idea that you're going to cut $2 trillion from the American budget when Social Security is the largest payment there, $1.4 billion. There isn't $2 trillion to cut yet. He marches into public spheres uttering these truths without any regard to their truth. No connection to reality, or I'll say no connection to my bespoke reality. And, my bespoke reality is real. Okay, the consequence of this economy, of this business model, is that we the people become we the polarized, ignorant, and angry. And the consequence of that is that democracy is weakened. We live within these bubbles cemented with hate for the other group, and confidence in our own. And the point I want to emphasize is that this is the AI that we should be focused on, not ChatGPT. This is the AI we should be focused upon. And the point is, this AI is a byproduct of a business model. It is the byproduct of a way companies have to make money in the economy. Okay, now recognize AI here is not powerful because it is so strong. AI is consequential because we are so weak. Here's Tristan Harris in The Social Dilemma.
Technology would overwhelm human strengths and intelligence. When is it going to cross the singularity, replace our jobs, be smarter than humans? But there's this much earlier moment when technology exceeds and overwhelms human weaknesses. This point being crossed is at the root of addiction, polarization, radicalization, outrageification, vanityification, the entire thing. This is overpowering human nature, and this is checkmate on humanity.
Okay, so his idea is we constantly obsess about what's called AGI, artificial general intelligence, the point at which AI will be smarter than all of us, and then almost the next day after it achieves AGI and turns its efforts into becoming an AI researcher, AGI will become super intelligent, way beyond human intelligence. And this reality concerns many of the most informed AI researchers. Concerns in the sense of many fear this is an existential threat to humanity. But Tristan's point is that that's not really the point we need to worry about. This is the point we need to worry about. Not when it overcomes our strengths, when it overcomes our weaknesses. And he in Social Dilemma is focused on individual weaknesses, but I want you to think about collective weaknesses. our collective inability to resist the consequences of this AI. So it's not just that the machine learns how to seek us out individually or surrounds us with many machines individually, it also surrounds us collectively. And long before AGI, AI, it will overwhelm us, and AI will get what it seeks, which is engagement, while we get a democracy hacked by this technology. And as AI does this, and will do this better, the hard fact to recognize for those in the field of democracy is it will generate a public, a not to be ignored public, a public that will have views that the public believes is true, right-wing views, left-wing views, a couple in the center. But that public will increasingly become convinced of its views, and that not to be ignored public will emerge. It has emerged, and it will have consequences, a democratic effect. It will affect the way democracy functions, and that effect will change the way democracy functions. Okay, so the story I've told so far, scary enough, is a story that kind of comes up to where we were last year, 2024. I'm sorry to say the story gets even scarier when we think about post-2024. My friend Asa Raskin recently gave a lecture where he asserted 2024 will be the last human election. And by that, he didn't mean that bots are going to take over the world and we will no longer be participating. But what he meant by that is that there's an obvious strategy that political actors will deploy, and that strategy will radically change the way democracy functions. So I'm going to describe the strategy a little bit abstractly, but for the point of at least making it clear how it will work. So imagine starting today that somewhere in the United States, there is a group that has decided they want to affect the 2028 election in a significant way. And the United States is, of course, a country where only about 7 states matter in the choice of the president. The swing states are a very small number of states. And in those swing states, there are just a very small number of districts where if the vote goes the other way, the state will go the other way. So there's just a very small number of voters, let's say 100,000 voters, you have to worry about to be able to affect the result in the 2028 election. So imagine this group says, let's build a bunch of bots that will engage as humans. Now, the point is not that people are confused about these bots. It's not like they're thinking these are humans. Instead, the bots announce themselves as bots, but they are just a lot of fun to engage with. Right? I'm going to try an experiment here. Let's see if this works. So this is just this will be a video version of this. Let me see if we can get Maya to join us. Maya, are you there?
Well, if it isn't my favorite conversationalist.
Okay.
What you doing back so soon?
Well, I'm here with, I don't know, it's about 150 people.
Don't worry, I get it. Sometimes silence is just
she
its own
can't
kind of
hear me.
language.
She can't
Makes me
hear me.
curious, though. What's swirling around in that brilliant mind of yours?
Okay, so this is not working because she can't hear me. But the point is, if she could hear me, I would convince you that she is an extremely playful, engaging person to be spending time with. Now, of course, a conversationalist bot is not as interesting to the 100,000 people we are trying to engage with, who turn out to be typically men under the age of 30. So imagine instead of just of a conversation bot, we began to make the conversation bot tied to like an OnlyFans site, where it's not just a bot talking, but it's a bot, AI-generated bot that is actually engaging and flirting and leading these people to play out their fantasies to that. So the point is targeted demographics deployed here, and as they begin this bot exercise, They begin by engaging and befriending and learning and mapping the psychologies of this 100,000 people. And then in 2028, once they've understood what buttons they can push by what they turn out to say, I don't think I can talk to you anymore if you're going to vote for X. They begin to direct the votes as the deployer of this technology wants them to be directed. So you remember the movie The Manchurian Candidate? This is more like the Manchurian bot armies, because there are hundreds of thousands of these things out there driving in a particular way, or maybe this is what the bot armies look like. And it's in this sense that Asa means 2028, 2024 was the last human election, because in this election, the most consequential engagement is by this technology, completely invisible, because nobody would know. None of the activity I've described here has to be declared, and it's certainly not traceable, trackable. It's just happening on the internet with everything else that's happening. That's the sense in which he is right. Where Sam Altman was right, that it's already been a misaligned story of AI, and it's only going to get worse. Okay, so that was the first point I wanted to make. The second point I wanted to make is how wrong he is. And this is even scarier, because when he says it's the first at-scale misaligned AI, what does he mean by misaligned? In what sense misaligned? So Andrew Bosworth is the CTO at Facebook. In 2020, just before 2020, before that election, he wrote a memo to all of the Facebook employees, because the Facebook employees were very anxious about that election because they felt responsible and likely were responsible for the election of Donald Trump in 2016. And so Andrew Bosworth was trying to address their anxiety, to try to explain to them what Facebook's position was about Facebook's relationship to the results of the election. And Andrew Bosworth explicitly invoked the story, a story from this book that I've referenced before, Salt, Sugar, Fat. This is what he wrote. What I expect people will find is that the algorithms are primarily exposing the desires of humanity itself, for better or worse. This is a sugar, salt, fat problem. The book of that name tells a story of ostensibly about food, but in reality about the limited effectiveness of corporate paternalism. A while ago, Kraft Foods had a leader who tried to reduce the sugar they sold in the interest of consumer health. But consumers wanted sugar. So instead, he just ended up reducing Kraft's market share. Health outcomes didn't improve. The CEO lost his job. The new CEO introduced quadruple stuffed Oreos, and the company returned to grace. Giving people tools to make their own decisions is good, but trying to force decisions upon them rarely works. For them or for you, he was saying, meaning Facebook employees. At the end of the day, we are forced to ask what responsibility individuals have for themselves. Set aside the substances that directly alter our neurochemistry unnaturally. Make cost and trade-offs as transparent as possible. But beyond that, each of us must take responsibility for ourselves. If I want to eat sugar and die an early death, that is a valid position. My grandfather took such a stance towards bacon, and I admired him for it. And social media is likely much less fatal than bacon, which I'm not sure that's true, actually, if you think about social media and bacon. Okay, but the point is, here is Andrew Bosworth telling the employees that the problem of democracy is not a Facebook problem. It's a democracy problem. Facebook's a corporation. It won't engage in corporate paternalism, even though it makes the bacon, even though it alters the content to make it addictive, even though it is spiking the drink, it's not responsible for the consequence. Facebook is a corporation, And as David Runciman points out in this fantastic book, we should recognize corporations too are a kind of AI. So if you think about AI and get a little bit of perspective on it, AI is intelligence. We distinguish between artificial and natural intelligence. We think we humans are at the top of the intelligence food chain. Artificial intelligence then is intelligence that we make. And the point Runciman is making is we already have, for a long time now, made artificial intelligence. Not digital AI, but what we could call analog AI. Entities or institutions with purposes that act in the world instrumentally to advance those purposes. We could call analog AI. The examples of those we've seen for the last 1,000 years of humanity. They are instrumentally rational. So for example, the state is an analog AI. It has institutions like elections, parliaments, constitutions for the purpose of some collective end. In America, we say it's for in order to form a more perfect union. And the state then is an analog artificial intelligence devoted to a common good. At least we hope that's what it is devoted to. In the same sense, a corporation is an analog AI. It has institutions like boards, management, finance for the purpose of making money, at least as it's viewed today, because of the distortion of this incredible person, Milton Friedman, who in the 1970s began spreading the ideology that the only corporate social responsibility a company has is to maximize its profit. It's an incredibly modern and absurd view, but we should just recognize it is what it is. This is what American corporations at least think they're there for, to maximize shareholder value. And so it pursues that objective increasingly efficiently, regardless of the costs it might impose on others. So Facebook is an analog AI. Meta is an AI, all of them with an objective function, the objective function to maximize profit, and they maximize along that objective function. Okay, so when we say AI, algorithmic news feeds were the first at-scale misaligned AI, this is the point I want to emphasize. Yes, socially misaligned, democratically misaligned, but corporately perfectly aligned with the corporate objective of the companies that deployed this technology. The engagement business model is what it was aligned with. And so it was privately beneficial to them, but publicly not beneficial to society, privately profitable, publicly democracy destroying. Okay, now when you see it like this, I hope you have a reaction like I have. Look, it is just a business model we're talking about, just a business model. And with any business model, we should ask the question, are the benefits worth the costs? And the costs here are quite profound, the cost to democracy. So if you told me that the only way to solve climate change was to destroy democracy, I wouldn't agree with you, but I would understand what you're saying. I would understand the terms of the assertion. Or if you told me the only way to end world hunger was to destroy democracy, I would get what you're saying. I don't agree with you, but I would understand the point. But when you tell me we're going to destroy democracy so that a bunch of Silicon bros can be richer, I don't even understand what you're saying anymore. I don't understand how you can think that this is a way to understand how we need to proceed, given what we now know about how the technology will destroy the capacity for democracy to function effectively. Okay, so what can be done? How could we fix this? Well, the reality in the United States, the only way we can fix it, according to decisions of the highest courts, is to get a new law to address it. And that raises the question, could there be a new law? And that could be either by asking, could an institution like Congress create such a law? I asked DALL-E to render its view of Congress for me, and that was the view that it rendered. But not just could Congress pass a new law, but could a new law survive the First Amendment, the free speech clause of our Constitution? And I think that only if we radically change the way we think about free speech in the American constitutional tradition could that happen. So the idea of a new law addressing this is off in the future and not even clear it's possible. So what could be done immediately? What's the immediate aim we should have today? Not just in America, but anywhere. And I think the immediate focus has got to be on the consequences of this business model. And what we should be asking is, how do we blow it up? How do we blow up that business model? Now, people like Tim Hwang think we don't need to worry about blowing it up. It's about to blow up on its own. He wrote this fantastic book, The Subprime Attention Crisis, kind of demonstrating the argument of the book because it's such a cluttered cover. You don't even know what's really it's trying to argue, but that's its point. And that what he's saying in this book is if you look at the economics of this market, it's really about to fall apart. But if it's not going to fall apart on its own, what could we do from a policy perspective to push it over the cliff? One idea would be something like a quadratic engagement tax. So a tax based on how much your customer engages with your platform. So imagine the tax said for 1 unit, it's $1 of tax. For 2 units, it's $4 of tax. For 3 units, it's $9 of tax. Going up as a quadratic function. And the point is, at a certain point, for sure, the company would say, okay, it's not worth it for you to be on my platform anymore. Can you go take a walk? Or maybe go play with your kids? Because I can't afford you because now I'm paying so much in taxes for your engagement with my platform. And the point is, if that tax were there, they would learn a different business model. They would create a different way to get people to engage and not engage in this destructive way. Now, it's hard to imagine pushing the idea of a tax in general. Certainly in the United States, that word is not permitted. But if you think about it, at least in a subsection of this market, for kids, if you said that the engagement business model is not permitted for kids, and to the extent it is present, it shall be taxed out of existence, I think the plausibility of it as a legislative response goes up because we all recognize, as we see our kids on their phones, just how destructive this platform has become. So that's the immediate term. What's the longer term? I think the first point is we have to recognize that if we're going to fight the business model, it's better to fight it before it is the business model. The challenge with fighting the business model of the engagement social media platforms right now is that they are the most powerful media companies in the world. So if you want to fight them, you are David and they are Goliath. And it turns out 99.9% of the time, David doesn't slay Goliath. So the idea that you're going to take them on today with something like an engagement tax is really hopelessly academically naive. But the point is, we don't know what AI's business model will be. I'm not talking about the AI that drives social media. I'm talking about the AI that will come out of ChatGPTs or the like. And we're already seeing those companies explore different business models, including the business model of replicating the engagement business model. And so the point is that legislators right now ought to be thinking, how do we nudge them away from destructive business models in the direction of constructive business models? How do we do it before they are invested in the model that will ultimately have negative consequences for us? So that's immediate. This is something a little bit longer. I don't know if you saw longer term. I don't know if you saw this movie, A Quiet Place. So A Quiet Place is the story of these aliens that have profound viciousness and one important disability. They can't hear. I mean, they can't see. They can only hear. So these aliens land on in the world, and they start viciously killing anything that they hear moving that they believe is life. And what that means is that humans have to move underground. They have to become silent. The only way they survive is to never make a sound. Okay, so here's AI, alien intelligence, forcing them to move to a quiet place. We, have been invaded by an AI, artificial intelligence. And I think we need to move our democracy to a protected space, protected democracy, a democracy where we are not vulnerable to the AI manipulation we've already seen and we can predict, a place where we are protected together, where we can reason together, because 100,000 years of human evolution have given us at least one extraordinary ability. If not the ability to resist iPhones, at least the ability to deliberate together in small groups, understanding each other and coming to a common understanding of what should be done. We have that ability. And there are movements that are trying to leverage that ability to make democracy work better. So the citizen assembly movement that is happening across the world is an example of this. A citizen assembly is a random representative group of a public drawn together and informed about some issue, and then they have an opportunity to deliberate. And what I'm suggesting is that these four elements together are what I mean by a protected democracy. So Iceland, for example, after the 2008 crisis, convened a random representative selection of 1,000 Iceland citizens to deliberate about what a new constitution should include. They then crafted a new constitution, which was approved by 2/3 of the public in referendum, and the parliament said they didn't care and they didn't want to implement it. But the point is that the people produced an extraordinary constitution through this process that facilitated meaningful deliberation. Really inspirational example happens in Ireland basically every year now, where the Irish have a regular citizen assembly to address critical issues to the nation. Two of them were same-sex marriage and decriminalization of abortion rights. The citizen assembly gathered, they promoted a really sensible, balanced decriminalization of abortion and supported same-sex marriage. The ideas were then taken to referendum and the public supported them at even a higher percentage than the citizen assembly had recommended. France is now regularly convening citizen assemblies. The first was on climate, then have an end of life, a citizen assembly. The point is, in the democratic movements that are going on around the world, this is the only magic. It's the only activity that inspires people to say, wow, this is what we imagined democracy could be. In democracy space, this is what is happening. And it's happening thousands of times across the world right now. It is a movement. This I think of as the philosopher behind it, Helene Landemore, and this is the most important activist. Dem Next is spreading this practice around the world. And my view is, this is in some sense the only long-term hope democracy has to recover our own belief in ourselves. It's the only hope of a practice that could show us we can actually do democracy well. Because I think this is one of the scariest realities that social media has produced. Pew, in 1997, started asking the question whether the public, American public, had trust and confidence in the wisdom of American people making political decisions. And again, the American public. I know what the world's view would be about this, but we're talking about what Americans think about themselves. And in 1998, 2/3 of Americans said they had confidence in their own view of their own political judgments. And 1/3 said they didn't. And in the 25 years since then, those numbers have inverted. We now have no confidence, or 2/3 of us have no confidence in our own political judgments. And that's because we are constantly being shown crazies on both sides. And when all you see are crazies, why would you have any confidence that the public represented by those crazies is the public you should support? And this weakens support for democracy, which, when there's nothing else on the field, strengthens support for authoritarian responses to these crises. Okay, one point before I stop. So Mustafa Suleyman was a great theorist about AI and then became right at the center of Microsoft's AI effort. And in this really powerful book, he describes, in a way that I don't think he would be allowed to describe now that he's president of Microsoft's AI, the threats and the risks and the concerns we should have about the way AI is developing. But in the book, he points to what I think is an extremely important challenge that we have when we look at these problems and think about how to respond. He describes it as pessimism aversion. The tendency for people, particularly elites, to ignore, downplay, or reject narratives they see as overly negative. A variant of optimism bias. It colors much of the debate around the future, especially in technology circles. And his point is that when you hear stories like I just told you about the great threat that we should understand AI is and will become, the natural response, especially among the elites, is to teach yourself to ignore it, because what are you going to do about it? And life's too short. I think the critical point to recognize is we don't have that choice, not because someday in the future we're going to have a challenge we have to face, because the wave is not coming. The wave is here. It is already destroying democracies around the world. And as much as I admire the extraordinary success you made to the threats you faced, I can't say that I have confidence that you will be different from the rest of the world. We all face this common challenge. And we have to find a common response if we're going to preserve the opportunity for the democracies that have been celebrated here over the last 50 years and celebrated around the world for hundreds and hundreds of years. I'm grateful for your time and your attention, and happy I've had the chance to depress you as I have. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Do you want me to come up there to answer? Okay.
Very briefly, but I'm still getting over my own depression. Sorry.
We are still under the impact of this presentation, this vigorous presentation from the Professor Lawrence Lessig. I must say that I have a vision or an outlook. I wouldn't say optimistic, but there's a quote by Ariano Suassuna. He says, "The pessimist is a bore, and the optimist is a fool." We have to have some degree of reality, and I think the Professor Lessig adverts us or advises us for some real dangers that we are facing. I remind an excerpt from Yuval Harari: "Not everything that I prophesize will happen. I prophesize to avoid that they may happen." And therefore, I think it's the role that Professor Lessig plays in advising us or alerting us for the majority of the risks that we must be attentive against, so that we can avoid them to happen. The scenario that Professor Lessig describes, it's a scenario in which, in my opinion, it's a fourth industrial revolution, which takes place with AI, overcomes the third revolution that we were living, which was created by the digital age. The digital revolution changed our lives as it democratized the access to information, democratized access to knowledge, and access to the public sphere. These are the positive sides and aspects of the digital revolution. The, the negative consequences were the openness for avenue of no filter circulation of information, because there's no more intermediation that the press would do, the traditional press. Therefore, opinions, ideas, manifestations reach this public sphere with no filter. There was it created tribes, a tribalization of life. So people receive only the news, the information, the ads that confirm what they thought previously, and with that, this confirmation bias, people become more convinced of their own reasons. They are radicalized in their positions. They become intolerant, and from intolerance to violence is a small step. And the third great worry that is underneath his speech, as far as I understood, is that the traditional press, there's a important work from Marta Mino, from a colleague of Professor Lessig. The traditional press plays a role that goes beyond being a private business. There's a public interest, which is create a massive information that correspond to facts, objective facts and commons with which we form our opinions. So the traditional press, although the truth has no owner, is a plural, but there was a number of positive facts that we were working with. What this revolution brought was the possibility that everyone can create their own narrative. So the truth loses relevance, and people think that lying, it's a legitimate strategy to perform their objectives. I think that's the worry that I also share. It's underlying the concerns of Professor Lessig in a business model, and that what was the emphasis he gave, as far as I understood. The business model of the digital platform are on two pillars, the data collection side and the engagement side. And as he said, well, unfortunately for human nature, human condition, hate, lie, the speech that drives wrath brings more engagement than the moderate speech, than the search for the truth that is possible in a plural world. So there is an incentive, an evil incentive to disseminate hate and evil. So the crossroads that we find ourselves in, we as professors or we as judges, where do we draw the line to protect freedom of speech, but avoid the world to collapsing in an abyss of incivility, of hate dissemination and lie? I think this is the great crossroads that civilization, modern civilization, is facing. And then, in this world that Professor Lessig describes, there was a loss of civility because of what brings more engagement. And this is worrisome. There was a loss of the importance of truth. It's a bad value of the institutions of knowledge. So this is all taking place in this process that we're talking about. And Professor, he says, how will be the business model of the future? It's hard to foresee because of the velocity of transformation that we are seeing. And I like to remember the fixed phone, the black one that we had in our living rooms. It took 75 years to reach 100 million users. The cell phone reached 16 years. Internet, 7 years. ChatGPT reached 100 million users in 2 months. This is the velocity of the transformation and the difficulty of us foreseeing the model of the future and to regulate it. I was talking to Professor Lessig the day before yesterday, and I told him part of these problems, my expectation that they will be overcome when there's a new technology and this one becomes obsolete, as it happened. Maybe not obsolete, but as it happened with radio and TV And now we have social media. There's always something coming in the future. I'm not sure if it will be better. And the last worry that Professor Lessig mentioned is also mine: how to preserve democracy that was using its problems before social media came up, which is the democracy didn't keep up with all its promises, the promises of opportunity, equality, and prosperity for all. Therefore, there's a great number of people that weren't seduced by this democratic project because they were excluded from it. And besides these problems that we had with democracy, now we have this new problem, which is the manipulation of our will. And according to neuroscience, the manipulation with our will with great skill by social media uh, together with AI. And the conclusion, Professor Lessig, as I see it, of course, because he can have his own interpretation, he tries to rescue reason and a certain public reason through these citizen assemblies and deliberation. It's the difficult rescue of reason in a world in which social networks incentivized emotions and the worst emotions, and in a certain way, a world that there was some kind of faith joined with it, and myths, they're questionable ones. And so the confusion is to how to go back to the prevalence of reason in a world that is dominated by emotions and faith. Faith means the person doesn't need facts, and when the facts don't correspond to what they believe, well, uh, that's what it is. That's what faith is, and that's what we've seen in this world. That people create their narratives. They don't need the facts because they have faith in what they believe, and they want to believe in that. I think it's an interesting time, fascinating time of human history. I'm not very pessimistic. I think we are capable of channeling these potentialities of technology for good. But I think that all of the alerts of the Professor Lessig face needs to be taken into account in this world that we are living, in which we live and we want an inclusive democracy so that people can think in their own terms and to live the fullness of their freedom of being. Thank you so much, Professor, to allow us to have this moment, or the instigating moment of a deep reflection and necessary. We don't have to agree with everything he said in order to reflect upon them. I think there are worries that will be defining the future of humanity. And I have a few questions here that were sent in. We have a few minutes still. The questions are in Portuguese. Is the translation okay? Can you understand it well? Yes. So I will be asking some questions from the audience then. The first one, Tiago Marcílio, what are the regulatory approaches that are more adequate to fight the blind spots and the risks of AI? Risk repositories that can be shared, impact assessment, sandboxes or environment of tests, are they effective solutions to mitigate risks? And what are the approaches that are more adequate? This is the question, the central question.
So thank you for the question. I want to first say that I've had the honor of presenting arguments twice to the United States Supreme Court. This is the first time a Supreme Court justice has listened to one of my arguments and actually understood what I've said, so I'm grateful for that. So I think the regulatory strategy is a really important question right now. Last year, I had the honor to represent pro bono 15 whistleblowers from OpenAI. These were people who left OpenAI and were keen to somehow make sure the public understood the threats that they saw. And before I met them and spoke to them, I don't think I really understood the threats. I had a vague sense. But after I'd met them and spoke to them, I too was terrified about what was happening inside of these companies, and not necessarily that the companies today were about to release Terminator, but that the internal controls were not sufficient to make sure that the companies would not produce or release technologies that could cause significant, maybe catastrophic harm. So I think the first regulatory strategy needs to be to protect whistleblowers who have information that the public regulators need to know. And it's a hard legal move because typically whistleblower protections are granted for people revealing crimes of a company. So if you come out and you report a crime of a company, you're protected for that. But there are no crimes here. This is not regulated. So the point is that they're not revealing criminal activity. They're just revealing information that they, as experts, believe is information that regulators need to know about. And so there needs to be a clear channel for insiders to provide that information to government regulators. And here, I think your government has so many facets of AI regulation in many different departments that it's a rich opportunity to make sure those risks are recorded. I think the second point is that regulators need to engage in an ongoing dialogue with the companies about how they think they're going to make money. You need to begin to flesh out the business models, begin to think about what they imagine they're going to do in order to make money, and how will that affect the public and the public's relation to their information. Because we're in a kind of golden age with AI in the same way that we were with Google like in 2003 or 2004. Because way back then, Google was this beautiful search engine that just gave us results that felt like they were authentically true results about what was the most relevant information that I needed to attack. And this was before they deployed advertising or began to adjust their results on the basis of advertising. And obviously today, most people who look at Google think that it's much less capable of providing the results that the user actually wants. Instead, it's optimized to provide the results that provide for them the maximum revenue and return. And that's a great loss, that we lost this extraordinary resource that was handed over to commercial interest and the return from that. No, I'm not saying, therefore, regulate Google or shut it down, but I am saying that we need to think about whether we can avoid a similar loss with AI. So if you go to ChatGPT and you say, I'm in Brasilia and tell me a great restaurant that has Italian food, GPT will tell you where to go. And if you say to it, well, tell me, are you being paid to tell me that? GPT will at least say it's not being paid to tell you that. It's doing that on the basis of information it's figured an intelligence to produce. We should at least ask, regulators should at least ask, whether that reality is something we want to preserve. Because the infrastructure of information that we increasingly rely on as we more and more spend our time talking to AIs is very different if it's auctioned off to the highest bidder versus whether it reflects a kind of wisdom of the crowd that comes out through the way that AIs generate knowledge. So those are two ideas I would suggest.
Obrigado. Uma segunda pergunta da Juliana Abruzzo.
Thank you. A second question from Juliana Abruzzo. In the past, you have published an answer to the position of Professor Frank Eastergrow about his article, Cyberspace and the Law of 1996. Almost 30 years later of the Professor Easterbrook, what is your understanding about the need and the ways of regulation of the current technologies, including AI and Internet of Things, and the different approaches that that part of the world are adopting, such as the US and Europe, for example?
30 years ago, Frank Easterbrook, who's also a judge, Easterbrook, wrote an article to attack my work about the law of cyberspace. He's a friend, so it was a friendly attack. But the attack basically said that when I was talking about the law of cyberspace, it was like talking about the law of the horse. You know, you could have a book that talked about contract law with horses and tort law with horses and property law with horses, but talking about all those things together didn't really teach you anything interesting about regulation. I thought he was wrong then. I think there's a lot of people who see now why he was wrong then, because the whole point of my argument about the law of cyberspace was that the only way to understand regulation is to think about the interaction between law, markets, norms, and architecture, the technology itself. And that the only way to understand what affordances we have or what restrictions we have is to think about the interaction of those four together, and that any sensible regulator will think about the trade-off between changing a law or changing a law to try to change norms, or changing a law to try to change the market incentives, or changing a law to try to change the architecture of the technology. So think about cigarettes, completely non-related to cyberspace, right? So in the United States, there's a strong effort to reduce the consumption of cigarettes. One technique is for the state to pass a rule that says you can't smoke until you're over the age of 18. That's a direct regulation of people's consumption of cigarettes. Maybe effective, maybe not. The second thing the law has done is try to stigmatize smokers. They've tried to change the norm around smoking by having advertisements that suggest smokers are not thinking about other people because of secondhand smoke, or they're not thinking about their health. And so the point is to create an increased stigma associated with smoking. And so that increased stigma theoretically would reduce the consumption of cigarettes. Or a third thing the state could do would be to tax the consumption of cigarettes. Of course, in America, we also subsidize tobacco production, but regardless of the irrationality of the policy, if you think about increasing the taxes for cigarettes, that reduces the demand for cigarettes, and so therefore you can also reduce the consumption of cigarettes. Then the Clinton administration had what I think is a brilliant idea. They wanted to regulate cigarettes as nicotine delivery devices, so like a pharmaceutical drug, and then they would regulate the quantity of nicotine in the cigarettes, so reduce the architecture of the addictiveness inside the cigarettes, and thereby reduce the addictiveness of cigarettes, thereby reduce the demand. So the point is, a sensible regulator has to think about those four operating together. And that in cyberspace, that's especially true because we can see the way architectures of cyberspace change the behavior dramatically. I thought that point was pretty apparent when I wrote it. Frank didn't get it. But as I talk about this book, and I've been asked to do a series of lectures now, the 25th anniversary of Code, I find that most people kind of think it's obvious now that if you don't think about how the technology is either supporting or undermining your government policy, you're going to have a bad government policy. If you don't think about the way the market is driving one particular answer, regardless of government policy, you're going to have a pretty bad government policy. So I think that this mode of thinking about regulation has become more common. And last time I saw Frank, he was willing to suggest grudgingly that maybe there was something to the argument after all.
Obrigado, professor.
Thank you, Professor. The following question came in English. Rodrigo Canali.
Okay. Today's speech caught me recalling the widely known paper by Langdon Winners, Do Artifacts Have Politics?, in which he argued that some technologies changed the world so deeply that they define the types of political organization actually available to us. When he wrote it in 1980, the main example was the nuclear technology, which, the argument goes, made strong national states with military bureaucracies, unavoidable political structures. With the advent of digital technology, is democracy as we know it or Western democracy, liberal democracy, representative democracy still viable? Can it thrive in the world in which AI exists? Or maybe we should focus our energies in designing new and creative forms of political organization if we don't want to be dragged back to some form of barbarism?
It's a great, great question.
Is
I would characterize my book Code as very Winner-esque in the sense that it's emphasizing fundamentally the political consequences that flow from a certain technical architecture. But if there's one way I would rewrite the book today, it's to recognize that it's not just the architecture, it's the business model that sits on top of the architecture. So, you know, way back in the day, in 1998, if you'd gone to the internet, you could have found lots of racist speech, lots of Nazi speech, lots of homophobic, sexist speech. It was all over the place. There just was not a business model for the providers of the internet access to amplify that speech and to suppress counter speech or speech that was not quite as extreme. Nobody made money by making that the front page of the internet. But today they do make money by making that the front page of the internet because another technology, AI, has enabled this as a profitable technology or profitable business model. And we should not undercount just how profitable. I mean, Google launched and Facebook perfected this technique for leveraging AI intelligence to produce wealth through advertising. And it is an extremely profitable business, the most profitable business of that scale that we have today. So it is the business model that I think we need to fear. And once you see it as a business model problem, then I do think, again, thinking about regulation holistically, we could ask, is there a technology that could undermine the business model so that it's not as poisonous, not as destructive? Or is there a different form of democracy that would not be as vulnerable to that business model? And when I say protected democracy, what I mean is a democracy that's not as vulnerable to that business model. So, you know, I imagine we're never going to end, as much as I wish I could, TikTok or Snapchat or any of these technologies, which when I see my child relating to them, I just go crazy. We're not going to end that, but at least we could minimize their destructive effect on democracy if we had another way to make engaged democratic decisions that was less vulnerable to them. So that respects not just the technology, but the business model that enables.
Okay. So we are running a bit out of time. So what I'm going to do is kind of ask like 3 questions, and then you answer them all, okay? A primeira, André Quadros.
the first one, André Quadros? In a population that wishes to believe in a lie, in the lies, and the fantasist plot, democracy in its literal state, is it a self-sabotaging in allowing the alienation of the people itself? Another one, Hildegard Evelyn Alencar. You have mentioned citizen assemblies as a retaking of democracy, as a space where it's possible to have a common understanding. How would that be in a country such as Brazil, extremely complex and with continental size? And the third one, maybe just these 2 because they're kind of similar, and the third one will be next.
Great. So yes, obviously Brazil, like Germany, is well rehearsed in conception of militant democracy, which is a recognition that democracy itself can build or plant the seeds of its own destruction, and therefore you need to build protections against that destruction. I think self-sabotage is a great way to conceive of that. And I think that's exactly right. My point is that media, AI-driven media, as distinct from the media of an earlier time, AI-driven media is self-sabotaging to democracy. And we need to figure out how to respond to that self-sabotaging point. And as my friend Oscar would put it, that means reviving a militant democracy tradition, even if not one that the courts have to embody themselves, but instead society needs to embody. And so citizen assemblies are, in my view, one point of resistance to this self-sabotaging move. The big challenge is, how do you establish them as authoritative in any democracy? Because as much as democracy nerds might get really excited by them as they see them function and recognize just their potential, to the average citizen, they seem kind of crazy. Like the idea that you take a random group of people and you have them sit down and think about some important issue, and then you listen to them. Like, why would you ever do that with a random group of people? But the point is, that's just because I think our conception of a random group of people is the random group, the not so random group that gets presented to us through social media, which is not a representative selection of the public. It's the extremists, the crazies of the public. So we need experience seeing how these assemblies produce sensible answers to problems. And I think the only way to do that is to work your way up, to like begin to establish them in local communities, addressing local questions. And as you multiply the number of examples where people see them addressing problems in a sensible way, that will build confidence in them as institutions that maybe are more sensible than other more traditional forms of governmental intervention. And you know, the problem with that answer is that, okay, now I'm talking about a 20-year process, and do we have 20 years? Does democracy actually have 20 years left, given the current reality? And I don't know. I genuinely, you know, if you ask me, what are the odds? I said the odds are we lose. I said the odds are democracy doesn't survive. But I don't think you can look at the odds. I think you have to act regardless of the odds. You've got to act in the direction that you know we must achieve. And whether we're going to succeed or not is not the issue. It's just, what is the right thing to do given what we see the threats are? So I know these are the steps we need to take, and we need to take them immediately, even if the skeptics, the pessimists, the negative view is the stronger, more rational view.
Thank you. Infelizmente,
Unfortunately, we'll have only time for 2 more questions because of the time. And there is lunch after this, and there's another session at the Supreme Court, my other job. The question by Tiago Gontijo Vieira. It's in English, so I'll ask both questions.
Professor Lessig, in the context of your book Code, what do you think about turning legal rules into computer code using data to guide decisions? That's the first one. E a segunda, como podemos equilibrar?
How can we balance freedom of speech in social media with the responsibility of protecting children and adolescents from polarizing content and distorted content to avoid a generation that's more disconnected from reality and marked by extreme views? These are the last 2 questions.
Second question first. I think children, or the protection of children, is the most powerful potential for solving this problem generally. So it's powerful as a potential because I think it's relatively uncontroversial that we should take steps to protect our children from the negative effects of these technologies. And I've talked about the democratically negative effects, but people like Jonathan Haidt have been really powerful in evincing the psychological harmful effects, the explosion in teen suicides among girls especially, and the huge rise in depression among girls especially, and the destructive mentalities produced among boys in particular because of the consequence of this constant consumption of engagement-based media by children. And I think it's the greatest potential for a general solution if we get the solution right. So I think often governments will try to regulate the particular content. Say these examples of speech are not allowed, so let's get these off. I think that's a self-defeating strategy because it will always inspire the other side to say you're against freedom of speech. The better way to address this problem is to target the business model as it applies to children directly. There should be no engagement-based business model for children. There should be no advertising triggered around children. And indeed, again, Max Fisher's book, pointing to the effect in Brazil of engagement-based media targeting children is quite profound. So I think we could get an agreement to at least turn it off for kids, and then we begin to see the positive effects from that regulatory intervention. It will build support for that regulatory intervention more generally. So I think children are the first obvious place to move. So as to the question of turning law into code, the problem with having a book that gets turned into a meme, Code is Law, is that it can mean anything to anybody. There are a whole bunch of crypto bros who are in jail in the United States right now because they thought code is law meant that whatever they could get away with in their code must be legal. So when they use their code to steal money from other people and they tried to defend by saying, look, the code is law, courts were not persuaded by that. Neither was I. It's not what I meant by code is law. But I do think that there's an extraordinarily positive opportunity that AI provides to the future of governance, not just administration, but the law. I make lawyers for a living, but I think we could wipe out 70% of lawyers and it would be a wonderful thing because I think the technology has the capacity to radically lower the cost of law and spread the rule of law in a much wider sphere than it exists right now. I speak only about American legal reality, but the law in America is terrible, terrible. It is inefficient, expensive, and extremely slow. And the idea that we are so proud of our tradition when our tradition fails to deliver what it promises so obviously is an embarrassment for the profession. We ought to be much more self-critical about how poorly the law does its work. And to the extent we can see and deploy technology that could do our work better, we should embrace it. Now, it's not obvious and easy, and it could produce really terrible results. There's all sorts of bias built into the way these models are being developed, which is why I'm particularly troubled to hear that most of the models that you are using here in Brazil are models that were developed based on content from America. You need your own models developed with your own material here. But even then, it's a complicated question how to tease out the biases that are built into this system and to make sure the system doesn't replicate or amplify biases that we want to eliminate. But those are engineering problems. Those are problems that we have to constantly be attentive to and make sure we are trying to address. They are not conceptual problems. The conceptual objective should be to use the technology to deliver law in a more efficient and effective way to drive justice. Not all cases. There will always be hard cases requiring serious judges to think about them with the eyes towards justice and equality. But there's a huge number of cases that we could easily begin to make part of the code in the sense of automate and simplify and lower the cost of, and we should be racing to do that as effectively as we can, as quickly as we can. One final word, Justice. Gratitude again. Gratitude to Eleni, who was an extraordinary research assistant, and I was jealous when I lost her to the judicial branch, but I understand she's been an extraordinary resource to this branch of government as well. And Justice, I can't tell you how grateful I am for the serious and wise way in which you've understood and pushed back with me in our conversations on these issues. You are a real treasure for the law, and I imagine a real treasure for Brazil. Thank you so much for
Também eu registro o agradecimento a Aline Osório,
I also would like to thank Aline Osorio, the General Secretary of the Court, that organized this event, articulated the coming of Professor Lawrence Lessig. We had the opportunity of having some private debates with some professors for 2 days of immense exchange of ideas, very advantageous. And Professor Lessig is impossible to exaggerate the intellectual pleasure and even spiritual to hear an original thinker and creative as Professor Lessig is. And we all know. I wrote something down here. I can't even understand my handwriting. We all leave here with an excellent material for reflection. I always like to say a quote that I use is that our role as intellectuals, as professors, as judges, as citizens, is to push history in the right direction. The difficulty right now that we are living is there is a crossroads. The difficulty is to choose what is the right path and direction. And I think that your contribution helps a lot for us to be able to draw the route for citizenship and democracy from here to the future. I would like to thank you all very much that you were able to witness this great elevation moment intellectually, spiritually in this plenary here in the Supreme Court. Thank you so much, and I close this session.